Heidi, welcome, and thank you for joining me for this installment of Curiosity Friday. Glad to have you with us today.
Thanks. I'm glad to be with you.
Terrific. One of the things about this self-imposed quarantine that we're all in now, maybe not so much self-imposed at this point, um, is that for people who are new to the church, you are just getting to know folks in the congregation, and folks in the congregation were just getting to know you. You came with your husband, Christopher. I want to say at first a little over a year ago. If I'm remembering correctly, you joined this fall. Um, so what an awkward time to be part of coming to a brand new community.
It certainly is a unique experience.
um, what can you tell us about yourself? What can you tell folks in the church? I know that's a little open-ended, but let's start there.
Yeah, so that's a difficult one in terms of knowing where to start. But one of the things that I mentioned in my bio that Kelly had asked for originally was that I was um, pretty much what you'd call a third culture child, and that
Hmm.
has been really formative in my life. So my parents are both from Austria, and I was born in the US and went to school here, but we had very close ties with my grandparents and culturally and friends. And so I spent a lot of my young years going back and forth and having a really close bridge between the U.S. and Austria, and that became even stronger when my youngest son, who was very adventurous, decided that he wanted to join the Vienna Boys Choir.
Oh my
And
Lord.
he's a very persistent child, so he was not to be put off. And he had heard something from a neighbor of my grandmother's whose son was involved and was um, talking about it. And so Stefan was very impressed with this idea. And so rather than just say straight out no, I wrote to them and said, I know this may sound really strange, but my son is really interested in this. And they wrote back the most lovely note. And long story short, they had one of the choirs going to perform at the Canton Palace Theater. And we went to the performance and then had um, an audition. And my oldest son, Marcus, became interested as well. So they both auditioned, and we ended up going there for the summer, my brother and I, so that the boys could go to the summer camp. And then they got an offer, and I ended up moving there. So um, with them on this adventure, and many thanks to my husband Chris for being very understanding and who held down the fort in North Canton. And this seemed very odd to other people, but it was really a wonderful experience for the boys. I ended up leaving my position, but ended up being involved in helping teach kindergarten at the Vienna Boys Choir School. And I really learned a lot from that experience, and have come to appreciate just how creative and strong and competent kids are. I think we often don't give them enough credit, even when they're 5 and 6 years old. They're amazing what they can do if they're nurtured and allowed to do that. So I also was an East Asian Studies major at Wittenberg, and I spent some time in China, which was very interesting. So it's just shaped my whole kind of life experience and the lens through which I view the world, and my children have carried on in that. So it was, I am very thankful to my parents for raising me bilingually and exposing me to the world as a larger place.
Oh wow, that's fabulous. I don't know where to pick up, Heidi. Um, so how long were you in Vienna in your
So
boys
I
in the
was able
choir?
to live there for 2 years, but my sons stayed longer. My husband had lost his job when the Hoover Company closed, and so that was a really stressful time for us. And we had to make the really hard decision as to whether or not we would try to bring him over or whether I should go back. And there was a library position that was available that was held open for me from Malone College, from my old employer, and that was really wonderful of them. So I ended up coming back, but the kids stayed over there because we had grandparents, and my parents had retired, and so spent a good part of 1 year watching out for the boys. So yeah, they I think it speaks to their experience that they didn't want to come home right away.
Oh, wow.
They were well looked after.
I don't know. Have you connected with Mel Herzog, one of our RE assistants? She has spent considerable time and has recently graduated with a degree in international studies.
Yes, I
And
really miss seeing her. We had some wonderful conversations, and I was really delighted to discover, a contingent of German-speaking first UUers. That was really nice.
I can think of, we have one German national and several others I can think of just off the top of my head who are, um, well, and I'm nowhere near fluent in German, so to my ear they're fluent, but I don't want to, I shouldn't presume. That's wonderful. It makes the world smaller and more, I don't know, more lively. And in the traveling that I've done, I've never been to Austria. I've been to Switzerland briefly. Um, all the traveling that I've done has made me a better, I think, at least, citizen of the world. And you've spent time, significant time in Europe. How long were you in China and whereabouts in China?
So I went to China with a study abroad program
Hmm.
with Duke University as part of my undergraduate studies. And I started out in Beijing in the summer for a language intensive program, and then went on to Nanjing for a semester at the university there. And just as we were nearing the end of the semester, around Christmas time, the unrest that led to Tiananmen Square broke
Ooh,
out.
ooh.
And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that that was not just going on in Beijing. There were movements of students and things of that nature going on throughout China, including Nanjing, and we would sit in our dorms because the university was walled. So there was a porter, and there were really pretty tall concrete walls surrounding the complex. And so we would sit in our dorm windows and look out and be able to see, what was going on, and of course didn't realize at the time what it was all leading to, but it was yeah, it left an impression. And my youngest son, Stefan, had to read John Pomfret's book, Chinese Lessons, and he recommended it to me. And I think for anyone wanting to understand that time period in China, that really resonated with me. So much of what he describes was my experience as well. And he went a couple years before I did,
Okay.
but I must have been 1989 that I went.
It must have been, yeah, that would have been the time for Tiananmen.
Yeah. So,
And certainly the news we get is, I mean, of course, with Twitter and other things now, many more people are having their voices heard. But back then, what we heard was really sporadic if it wasn't um, sort of approved news. At least that's my sense of it. And I know I'm speaking from ignorance as much as anything.
no, I think that's an accurate assessment. And some of the students that I was in class with were actually talking to reporters from various news outlets to, share what we were seeing and experiencing. So it was my first experience of kind of tumult and chaos. And I had been pretty sheltered up until that time.
It's a whole different experience than most of us have here, anyhow.
Yeah.
Um, You also mentioned, I'm going to jump topic here, Heidi. Um, there were two other things that you thought might be of note. First, and these are quite disparate, I think, beekeeping and your time in an ashram in Northern California. Um, would you speak to either or both of those?
Sure, they're actually combined. They
All
actually do
right.
have a common thread because one of the yogic practices of what we call the bee breath, of making a buzzing, comes from observation and knowledge of the bees. So the bees have been long revered in Hindu spirituality practices. So there is a common thread.
I am learning as I listen. This is great.
So it was so fascinating to me when I started keeping bees. It sort of just happened. I was joking with Chris that I really wanted chickens, and he wasn't too thrilled with that. That was really moving into livestock that he wasn't ready for. So I remembered that one of my parents' friends was a beekeeper, and I was so fascinated with what he did as a child. And so I just said, okay, well then we're going to keep bees. And it was amazing. I think it's gotten a lot more complicated, at least that was my sense of it, because the beekeeper would kind of install the bees, keep an eye out for them, but didn't, I think, have to be as involved as we are now in terms of all the disease and the threats that bees face. So I ended up learning a lot more in terms of the things I needed to watch for and be aware of and to help them than I think my parents' friend, Mr. Eck, would have said. So um, observing them, each hive had a different personality. So in time, I could notice things about them and how the bees looked and how they were in community. And they're really a fascinating study in community. And there are a lot of things that threaten bees, and they've, I think, weakened genetically. There was a lot of really good support through OSU and Extension and the OERDC that did really great training for those of us that were getting into beekeeping. I would highly recommend it. And one of my colleagues at Walsh was also interested. So we ended up kind of going down this journey together. And then it's like what always happens. You're focusing on something and then you keep running into people that are doing, having the same interest at the same time. So met some really great people that way. And when the hive becomes weakened, sometimes predators like wasps will attack them and kill the bees and take the honey. And I had that happen with one of my hives, and it was really hard. It was very sad, and there wasn't much I could do at that point in time. But they started flying outside of my dining room window, and they never would come there because the hive was much farther back on the property. And I was talking to Sister Cecilia, a dear friend of mine, and I saw the bees circling and circling, and there was nothing in that outside of that window in terms of flowers that would compel them to be there. And so then they disappeared. I had to go run an errand, and I came back and they were gone. The hive was completely empty. So she and I came to the conclusion that this is just one of those wonderful, like, great mysteries where we are just given a message and an experience to realize that there's so much more, and just the glimpse of the divine. And she and I like to think that they were saying goodbye, that we had some sort of a connection. And they knew that I tried to care for them, and it just wasn't going to work. Like yeah.
But they were there. I can easily see that they were trying to communicate something, and goodbye works as much as any.
Yeah.
One, one of the things that I've learned is that the more you see, the more you look, the more you see. I never have heard, not that my reading or delving into this is exhaustive, it's not at all, that each hive has a distinct personality. That is wonderful that you've noticed that. I'm not surprised once I heard it, but I never would have imagined otherwise.
That was my experience, and I really became fascinated by the top bar hives, which are different than the traditional boxes that you see. So top bars are used a lot in other parts of the world. They're easier to make. Like you could cut a drum in half and lay bars across the top, or you can make it yourself. So um, they have to build their own comb when they do that. So instead of
Okay.
giving them the basis, they just have the bars at the top that they attach this beautiful comb to, and it's just amazing to see that develop from their innate ability. And it's it's good environmentally because we see so much more contamination in the traditional hives. You have to get rid of those frames, I think, much sooner than we used to, because they turn black so much more quickly from all of the dirt pollution, um,
Interesting.
those things. So the top bar, when you harvest that honey, you're taking the honey and the comb, and then they rebuild it so they are able to it's cleaner because it's being renewed, built fresh. But it was just amazing to me to see them building that. And I had a little window in the side of my hive so I could see what was going on without disturbing them.
Oh, that's terrific. That's terrific. Um, you've been very gracious with the gift of your time today, Heidi. Um, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, because I'm simply not remembering, and folks may be curious, how did you find our congregation? How did you discover Unitarian Universalism?
So as we were leaving North Canton, and I there was a congregation in Worcester, and that's where my parents live, and we had never had the opportunity to really explore that. And so we thought, since we were making all these changes in our lives, that we would explore this. And the ashram has something to do with that. I have a friend that was a professional musician and moved out to California and is part of the ashram, and she invited me to come out last May, and I spent some time there, and it was really wonderful and centering and a spiritual foundation that I really appreciate, and a regular spiritual practice. And I remember Babaji saying, you have to stop digging potholes. You need to, like, it's important to be disciplined and dig deeper. And I think he's right. And so coming here and needing to do everything anew, we thought, well, we'll explore this. And it's been delightful because it brings so many things together for us, and it feels entirely natural. And I'm able to continue the spiritual practice that I have, but incorporate it with this First Few You family. And I just am grateful that it happened at all. And now, of course, it would have been wonderful if I would have been in my 20s, but that's just the way life goes.
Oh, sadly, sadly.
Yeah, you I guess are on the road that is meant to be, and you find your way there eventually. And the things that happen along the way, I think, are designed that way. It's just part of it.
I think that's often, often true. It's a winding road, isn't it?
It is. It
Yeah.
is.
Well, Heidi, thank you very much for your time today. I'm sure people will be thrilled to hear and learn more about you and Christopher's journey, your boys in Vienna Boys Choir. That sounds just wonderful. Um, thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. And I'm so grateful for everyone that I have met at First UU and have yet to meet. And I'm looking forward to spending more time with everyone,
May
whether that
that
be virtual or in person.